it's perfectly possible to have a strong nation that people feel patriotic about and think is a good project, because the nation state is the best thing we have found, in my view, to do politics within and manage human affairs within, while believing that nation state should be run in as free market, small government, liberal, open to the world way as possible.
Welcome to Parallax Views, an IEA series of conversations about the politics of culture. My name is Marc Glendening, and today I'm very pleased to be talking to David Frost. I've been looking forward to speaking with David because he's one of the few figures in public life today who does the vision thing. So much conversation and commentary about contemporary British politics are conducted in a very siloed and fragmented way, whereas David is very much a big picture type of thinker, as well as a prominent public figure. David deserves a very long introduction, but you're not going to get one because of the shortage of time. Suffice to say that David has been a senior diplomat, former ambassador, official in the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, member of the House of Lords, member of the cabinet, and most famously, the person who negotiated the exit agreement with the European Union for Boris Johnson. Could I start by asking you, before we come on to broader political matters, I'm very keen to find out about what they would have described as on the X Factor as your journey politically. How did someone who was a career civil servant from 1987 become the most prominent spokesman today in public life for free market and culturally liberal ideas? One might have assumed that you would have gone on to become head of a Quango. You'd be listening approvingly in your home to podcasts by Rory Stewart and Alistair Campbell, that you would be part of, the proverbial blob, but you obviously are not. So how did that come about?
Well, thanks for having me here, Mark. It's good to talk. I think, my own intellectual journey, without going into the detail, really, I started off in the Labour Party, as I said, a long time back when I was a student. And I guess as I went into public service, I still had the sort of conventional beliefs of, young people in Labour at the time. But it was pretty soon knocked out of me. And I think for me, the decisive time was going to Brussels in the 90s, where I gradually realised that the way the European worked was rather anti-free market, pretty statist, not working in the interests of the UK, and I was a small minority, obviously, in the Foreign Office in thinking that, and everything from that has followed. I think I am, unfortunately, unusual in thinking these things as a civil servant. It shouldn't be like that. We need cognitive diversity in the civil service as everywhere else if we're to work effectively.
I mean, do you think that the sort of managerial public sector class is evolving into a distinct sort of semi-self-conscious political movement? Does it have a collective sense of interest, or is it just coincidental that all the top civil servants seem to have exactly the same views on virtually every issue?
I think it's I think it is a bit more complicated than that. So when I joined the Foreign Office in the late 80s, it was a pretty small C conservative organisation. It seems almost kind of ridiculous to think of it like that now, but it definitely was. And it gradually changed. And I think what happens is the civil service represents the currents in wider society, and wider society has changed, and so does the civil service. The difference in government, of course, is that you can remain untouched by reality and the pressures of real life to make a living, to kind of interact with the real world in a way that you can't in the private sector. In the end, reality tells in the private sector. In government, you can kind of pretend. It doesn't always have to be like that. And I think that's why you see these extreme forms of, diversity, equality, inclusion, kind of reluctance to look at how economies actually prosper and succeed in the real world. It's easier in government to kind of remain aloof from it.
I mean, you've written, I was reading one of your articles recently in which you were arguing that a sort of semi-official state ideology is now sort of coming to fruition, which is an incredibly dangerous thing, isn't it, in a democracy, when the civil services, like the police, are meant to be non-partisan.
Yeah, exactly. And of course, it goes more widely. It's it's the public sector more broadly, not just the civil service. That if you espouse a certain set of views, you will find it difficult to hold down a job in a lot of the public sector. That's just the reality of it. You have to keep quiet about them. And I think that is extremely damaging, worrying, troubling. I don't quite understand how it's been allowed to happen under a Conservative government, but it has, and it's really worrying.
Yeah, I mean, I was just talking to a Labour friend of mine who's a local councillor in London. I mean, who's just been booted off the cabinet in his council because he's opposed the transgenderisation of the only female public lavatory in his borough and has been told he will not be standing at the next set of council elections. So we get this extraordinary and bizarre intolerance now, where any kind of non-conformity is now just immediately punished, as if we were living almost in a sort of one-party state. I know it sounds a bit shrill to say that, but it is kind of extraordinary, isn't it, what's happening in every kind of sector of British society. I mean, we saw the Nigel Farage, Coots debanking thing. I mean, there's something strange going on, isn't there?
There is, and I don't think any of us have really got to the root of kind of what has produced it. I do think a big part of the problem is the weak culture of free speech generally. I don't know whether that's a cause or a consequence, but it's definitely around. And this sense that, we can't agree to disagree about things, that people who think certain things should just be quiet because their words are harmful and it's better not to say them. This is a really new thing, and I think if we had a stronger culture of free speech, some of these idiocies would just sort of fade in the sunlight. They wouldn't be sustainable. It's subject to real debate. So we need to do something about that. We have not allowed free speech to flourish in the way that we should have. And that is new, I think.
Yeah. I mean, moving on, but sort of closely connected to what you've just said, I want to ask you about the broad terrain, cultural terrain that the Conservative Party will have to face or continue to face after the next general election, the terrain it'll have to operate in. I mean, playing sort of devil's advocate for a moment and being rather downbeat, will it not be very difficult for a reformed Conservative Party to compete electorally, given the sort of changing nature of the culture? So, let me just identify three things. First of all, it seems to me that there are less people involved in particularly business who are now the sort of people who want to vote for lower taxes, lower regulation, the sort of entrepreneurial class, now a growing percentage of the business class seem to be people who want an economic safe space. They want to work from home. Some of them like greater regulation because their jobs as PR, HR type people are linked to, the state actually sending out all kinds of diktats that they then have to enforce. Growing percentage of the middle class seem, especially in the southeast, seem to be sort of politically woke, obsessed by climate change, net zero. They're instinctively anti-patriotic. They like the EU precisely because it isn't democratic. And then also, will a Conservative Party of the future, if it returns to government with a different sort of prospectus, have the problem that the managerial new class will try to prevent it from doing anything because of the Equality Act, because of the Human Rights Act, the whole, phenomenon of judicial review. So how will a Conservative Party of the future operate?
So it will be difficult. We have to recognise that the culture has got away from us, and we are in part responsible for that, I think. So first thing is, politics is about persuasion. If you don't talk about your ideas, if you give in to the ideas of your opponents, you can't expect people to kind of come back to you and do what you want to do. And I'm afraid for the last 20 years, we have not spoken up about the value of free markets, the value of economic liberalism, the value of running your own life and not allowing government to get in the way. And we have given too much to the weirder forms of social liberalism. And the Conservative Party is obviously a divided church on some of these questions, and people can see that. So we've got a situation, as you say, where all the opposition takes one set of views, and a good chunk of the Conservative Party does as well. So the arguments that we stand for have not been made, and we must now start making them properly, even if it's painful, and even if in the short run people say it's nasty, we should go with the zeitgeist. I think it's always been, well, for a long time anyway, it's been unfashionable to be a Tory. I'm not sure that the culture in that sense is any worse than it was 20 years ago. The phenomenon of shy Tories who didn't talk about it but still voted for them has always been there. Of course, we did offer something for people's self-interest. We did offer tax cuts. We did offer things that people liked, even if they didn't acknowledge it. Well, we're not offering those things now. So you must expect the culture to be dominant in these areas. Finally, I think, again, it's always been true that big business has, been, how shall we say, it has worked with governments. It doesn't like disruption. It doesn't like entrepreneurialism. It likes to, if it can, squeeze out competition. And that's always been the case. So I don't find it surprising that we're seeing some of these phenomena in a slightly different form nowadays. The answer to all those things is politics about persuasion. Speak your ideas, explain what you think, have a coherent set of views about the world, and get them out and start explaining them. And that is going to take time. The work that Mrs. Thatcher did in the 70s about markets, about free markets, about liberal economy, it's all got to be done again, unfortunately. And the sooner we get on with it, the better.
And plus, of course, in relation to the culture, because at least in the sort of 70s and 80s, putting to one side, the very hard sort of Marxian left who didn't believe in free speech, mainstream centre-left people, were impeccably politically liberal, if not economically liberal. But now, even the mainstream left, we'll come on to that a bit later, but the mainstream left is now, dominated by people who clearly do not believe in free speech on kind of a whole range of issues. So that's more of a test. But we also have a problem, or do political liberals not also have a problem within the Conservative Party, as you were saying? I mean, people like Theresa May and I know Caroline Noakes and Alicia Kearns and people seem to be going along with this new left agenda on cultural issues.
Yeah. I mean, that is obviously one of the new things in politics, that kind of values and culture are becoming just as important as the traditional free market state split, although they are, I think, connected in some way. I personally, I think the Conservative Party has become too broad a church. It feels as if sometimes there's no opinion that could not be contained within the bounds of the Conservative Party nowadays. There are statists, there are free marketeers, there are kind of trans rights advocates, and there are strong social conservatives. And I don't think you can continue like that. I think the Conservative Party has always obviously been quite a broad church and had different views within it, but I still think there was some philosophical coherence on some of these issues, and that seems to have been frittered away in recent years. And to me, the idea that you can find people in the Conservative Party who think that the tax and spend burden is okay where it is and could safely be a bit higher even than where it is now. That is not a Conservative opinion for me. That is not something we should be giving space to. But there it is.
Yeah, indeed. So you made you gave a very major speech to the North East Tories quite recently, and I was wondering if you kind of could encapsulate your kind of broad vision for how a party of the centre right should change compared to now. What would be your big themes to revitalise the Conservative Party after it presumably loses the next election?
Well, on that point, let's see. I don't want to give up.
That's my view. I know that's not yours.
If we had an election tomorrow, I wouldn't give much for our chances. But things can change, and let's see. One shouldn't despair quite yet. So my view is that the right mix is what I call sort of, on the one hand, freedom and growth in the economy, on the other hand, nationhood, rebuilding the country. And it often gets thought that if you're in favour of free markets, you must also be a sort of globalist. And I'm trying to use the word non-pejoratively, but you're happy to see the nation state kind of weakened. You like international institutions, you like the IMF, you believe in that sort of world. And similarly, it's also often thought that if you kind of believe in the nation and borders and this sort of thing, you must also be a protectionist and a statist. And I don't see why either of those things are true. It's perfectly possible to have a strong nation that people feel patriotic about and think is a good project, because the nation state is the best thing we have found, in my view, to do politics within and manage human affairs within, while believing that nation state should be run in as free market, small government, liberal, open to the world way as possible. And that's my view about where we should go.
So would it be fair to describe you as a national liberal? There's this fissure. There are lots of fissures, as you have alluded to, within the contemporary Conservative Party. But some people on the more classically liberal wing of the party are concerned by the emergence or the attempt to inject a sort of national conservative agenda, which seems to be just to echo various themes coming out of America. There was the big National Conservative Conference a few months ago around the corner from here. So would you accept that that is a pretty major line of distinction within the modern centre-right between what I would call national liberalism, and which you seem to be espousing, and on the other hand, more authoritarian, more religiously influenced national conservatism?
So I think all these words have become in a kind of gradually deprived of meaning, or rather they mean different things to different people. So, I wouldn't describe myself as a national conservative or a national liberal or any of these things really, or at least I don't think the words are usefully meaningful to the people who are kind of listening to me. I think that I am less worried by the social conservatism of national conservatism. I think that has a legitimate place in the conservative kind of worldview. I am worried by the protectionism and statism that some in the national conservative movement seem to have. You hear people sometimes talking about business in the way that Jeremy Corbyn would have talked about business as, a force that dissolves all normal human bonds and leaves people in kind of servitude to global multinationals. I don't think that. I think that's a wrong approach. But I do think that it is reasonable to talk about the kind of traditions of your country, which includes a religious tradition, and to think that's part of what makes up a national identity. And a national identity is part of what makes a nation a workable unit. So I'm not so worried by that. And indeed, I think we've gone so far in this country in kind of dissolving the country as a sort of meaningful, some people don't really seem to kind of believe that Britain as a country is a meaningful or worthwhile thing at all, or they think it's a constellation of 4 other countries that just happen to have come together for convenience. I think it's gone so far that we need a bit of pushback about our history, our traditions, border control, and connected stuff like defence and cracking down on crime, the sort of things that make non-economic life worth having. That is all really important, and but I don't see any contradiction between that and saying the government ought to be a lot smaller than it is now. We ought to allow people much more personal freedom and autonomy than they're getting at the moment. That we should not have the sort of lifestyle hectoring and controls that we're getting, and that the country should be as open as possible to the world and our friends in terms of trade. I just don't get why this has become a unfashionable mix of policies in recent years. It was actually, to a large extent, what made Mrs. Thatcher succeed, and I don't see why it won't succeed again.
Yeah, I mean, a specific issue I'd like to raise with you, which I suppose possibly goes to the heart of the conflict between the type of conservatism you represent, with, on the one hand, the New Left, but also possibly with some elements within the Conservative Party, is the issue of the online safety bill. It seems to me extraordinary that a government calling itself conservative would push with the great enthusiasm that Nadine Dorries and Boris initially pushed this piece of legislation, which the left have been campaigning for decades, where the state needs to regulate the media and now the internet in the most extraordinary kind of detail. And a lot of people on the right support this because they think there's too much sexy stuff that young people can access, and that needs to be clamped down on. So you're getting the kind of authoritarians of the national conservative type, but also the modern left, contemporary left, are coming together, and a conservative government is delivering them what they want.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a monster, the online safety bill, obviously. It's a bit better than the first version, but it's still a monster. It tries to do too many different and contradictory things, and it gives too much power to unaccountable state organs. And I think it's going to be a real problem. I wish the government had just focused on a much narrower kind of bill that concentrated on protecting children, enforcing age limits, trying to kind of ring fence that aspect of it, and say everything else is fine. It's up to you.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, the protection of children attitudes have spread out into the wider debate about free speech online, so that it's become almost like the government has a job to protect you from anything mean or uncomfortable or difficult you might come across online, and I think that's damaging.
Where's that going to end up?
Yeah.
It's potentially infinite, the amount of censorship that mindset would,
every time I
lead to.
open social media, I get a stream of people telling me, what they think of me in the most intemperate, most unpleasant
I can imagine.
terms. And, I don't like that, but there's a block button, there's a close button. I don't have to look at it. I certainly wouldn't say the government needs to protect me from it. And I just think we all need to be a bit, when you're grown up, when you're an adult, you should behave like an adult and, just put up with things. Get on with your life. Don't worry about it.
Nobody's forcing you to go on the internet
Absolutely.
or engage in public life. It's a choice you've made. But it seems to me this is part of a wider sort of anti-humanism that has crept into our society, and that makes a liberal society is sort of impossible, because if you define everybody as being vulnerable, everybody needing protection, not just from sort of physical violence, but also from words and lines of argument, then that is a sort of slippery slope, it seems to me, towards some sort of authoritarian state.
Yeah, I worry very much about what we've seen in recent years. And, we all saw during the pandemic the kind of controls that the social media companies were induced to impose on expressions of certain kinds of opinion. And they haven't entirely gone away, even now. The videos, podcasts are taken down by some companies because they transgress a political judgment rather than a legal one. And I think this is, what I want to say, I think this is really, really problematic. And I mean, that in itself, even using that word, shows how we've all got kind
the
of
virus
dragged
is
into
spread.
this.
Yeah.
But I'm beginning to think this country at least needs some sort of free speech act that polices the boundaries and says that defines the conditions in which free speech is possible. The obvious risk for that is that trying to pass any such thing just produces a further set of conditions and constraints. So it's not straightforward. But the space is being closed gradually for free debate about certain things. And somehow we've got to put a stop to that.
My last question relates really to your view of what is happening on the left, because obviously that has a major impact on how a centre-right of the future responds to it. Is it too dramatic and shrill to suggest that the contemporary, what I call the culture control left, is actually evolving into a fundamentally anti-liberal and anti-democratic political movement, that there's a logic at its heart now to do with ideas, postmodernist ideas relating to the power of language, which mean that it'll just inexorably, if it's allowed, continue building upon a sort of legislative base, which is incredibly oppressive. I mean, a left-wing friend of mine of a more traditional stripe says that he believes the left is now a sort of proto-fascistic movement. How would you characterise the modern left, and how should the centre-right respond to it, its new kind of form?
Yeah, so there's obviously a extremist left, which was very strong under Corbyn, is still very strong, but less strong in the current Labour Party, and it is dragging the left more broadly leftwards. For all that Starmer is trying to reinvent himself as a Blairite, he has to manage this part of his party, and I've no doubt we'll see it come out again if they do win the election. I think broadly what we're seeing is, in a way, maybe the far left is just more honest about what they want to see. But actually, I think some of these ideas are quite widely spread across the political spectrum. The belief in control, the belief in constraint of freedom and normal activities is quite strong. And actually, I fear that the whole net zero thing is a big part of the reason for this. That is become defined as this existential crisis, in support of which constraint on your lifestyle, your activities, the kind of normal behaviours is all justified. And that is obviously, clear on the left. It's also clear on part of the right, I think. I fear things like, digital currencies, central bank or otherwise, and the ability this gives to governments to cut off funding. I guess I just generally fear that we are handing too many powers to a government to constrain behaviour, constrain normal free activities by autonomous people. And that isn't just a phenomenon on the left at the moment. It's stronger on the left, but the worrying thing about it is how widely it is spread and how few people you hear speaking up for the free individual who's allowed to make up their own mind about things and live their own life in their own way. That's the countercultural thing nowadays.
Yeah, and that is the thing. I think that you've gone to the root of it. That people I would refer to as progressives in the liberal tradition need to confront, because virtually nobody in public life seems to believe in the idea of the autonomous individual. Okay. So we're seeing a sort of counter-enlightenment, a new counter-enlightenment. We're going back to a sort of pre-modernist period where everybody was seen as in some way the bearer of a particular role, as being in some way determined by forces beyond their control. So it seems to me we've regressed, or are regressing, to a pre-Enlightenment period. So for me it's the opposite of progress. It's the opposite of being progressive.
I'm always reluctant to describe it as pre-Enlightenment, because I feel it kind of plays into the narrative that the world lived in a repressive religious community for sort of 1600 years and then suddenly came out of it, whereas actually I think Christianity in particular, but other religions too, have been a big part of sort of defining the autonomous individual and the importance
absolutely. Particularly the sort of non-conformist tradition.
Yeah. So I think it's a bit more complicated than that. So I think I struggle to find the words sometimes. It's almost as if we're going back to a world where people should know their place and not aspire to the normal things that over the last 100 years people have thought they might aspire to travel, to earn more money, to look after their family, to kind of broaden the range of human potential and aspiration,
which is now defined as being privilege.
Yes,
and something
exactly.
By implication you shouldn't be allowed to have.
Yes,
or should be taken away from you. Yeah.
And gradually these ideas become normalized. 5 years ago, the idea that you would constrain people's abilities to take flights, for example, that was the sort of freakish opinion. Now it is debated. It's beginning to be debated as an idea. Give it another 5 years, and it's going to become normal. Constraints on where you can drive. There's another kind of aspect of that that's gone a lot further down the road. Constraints on when you can use your electricity in your own house. Well, that is kind of coming in the greater interest. And that all these things only seem to go one way. And we risk ending up in a situation, down the road, where you live your life at the mercy of and under constraints set by an extremely strong state. And that's, well, we got a glimpse of that in COVID, in the pandemic, and I didn't like it very much, and I don't want to go back there.
And I think that's a great note, Lord Frost, and a very positive note on which to end our conversation, which I found fascinating, and thank you for taking the time to talk to us.
Great, thank you very much.
Thank you.